So, hello, good afternoon. It's my pleasure to start the new academic year with a lecture for which we have invited Professor Ekaterina Lapshinova-Koltunski. I think, as far as I can say, I hope that we can combine our knowledge or love or whatever to linguistic as well as to some formal aspects of translation. So I hope that the lecture will interest all of the participants. Professor Lapshinova actually graduated at Volgograd University, but then spent several years at different German universities, in Stuttgart, if I remember well, in Saarbrücken. And now she is appointed at the University of Hildesheim. Sorry, it's too new a university for me to be able to pronounce it correctly. So welcome, and we are interested to see what we can, as linguists, contribute to translation in the sense of the product and processing data. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I would like to thank you for this invitation. I was really happy to receive this invitation. And it's not my first time at this university. We were already talking about how many years have been gone since I've been here. I think it was 2017 as I last time came here for TextLink training school, and TextLink was this initiative where we also collaborated a little bit in terms of discourse relations. Discourse connectives. And today I'm going to talk about translationese because translation is one of my focus area of my research. I can call myself a linguist. Yeah, so like we are all linguists with some specialization, either computational or applied, and translation studies are the area of applied linguistics. And before I start with the content, before I will show you what I planned for today, I would like to say that I will present results of various studies during this lecture, and they don't come from my own projects, but from collaboration with many colleagues. And the main project from which I derived a lot for this lecture is a project called Translation as Rational Communication, which is a part of Collaborative Research Center Information Density and Linguistic Encoding. And I see also someone from another project, from a sister project in this collaborative research center who works in B1, I think, yeah. C7, sorry. Yes, of course, C7 on the typology. So I would like to acknowledge Elke Teich, a colleague of mine with whom we co-supervise this project, and also other colleagues, Kristina Polklesner, Heike Pschibel, Maria Kunilovskaya, who work in this project. Frances Jung does not work in B7, she works in a different project in B2 with Vera Demberg. But we collaborated on one study on discourse connectives, and Yuri Bizzoni used to work in Collaborative Research Center, but left us and is now in Denmark. And so this is the part about translation product. I remember in the title I was talking about translation product and then process. And the work on the process research comes from a different project, which was called Data Triangulation and Translation Process Research. So it was a seed funding project, and now we are working towards a bigger project where we combine experimental and corpus-based analysis to analyze a translation process, and actually to try to understand what happens in translation process and what has an impact on what we see in translation products, in the translated text. And here, I also collaborated with several colleagues, Silvana Dylan, who is also at the University of Hildesheim, Anna Lafrenz, who is our master's student, and Michael Carles at the University of Kent. And he is actually an expert translation process research. So I will start my talk with a brief introduction in translationese, because I'm not sure how many of you know what translationese is. It's the term is used also in the area of machine translation, but sometimes with a different understanding what it is. Then I will talk about methodology, because translation product and translation process are normally analyzed with different methods. And we'll show you some examples from our own analysis. And then in the end, maybe we can have some discussion on disadvantages and advantages of using both or separately, separate methods. So translationese, as they are defined in translation studies, they are specific features of translation. I put in brackets also interpreting, because this is something that we are interested in our project, interpreted, simultaneous interpreting, so spoken translation. We could say that's all translation, but we have written and spoken translation compared to originally written or spoken language production. Yeah, so imagine when we speak in one language, but don't necessarily have this something in the background in other texts that we transfer into a different language. Yeah, so we produce a language or a text, speech originally, and we compare it to the translated or interpreted language production, and there are studies showing that there are differences, and there's differences of linguistic kinds. So there are different distribution of, let's say, discourse connectives and other linguistic structures. So why do these differences, why do they occur? Yeah, so on the one hand, we know this already from the studies, from corpus-based studies, that there are these differences, but the question is, why do they emerge? And this is actually what is interesting for us, not just to say, okay, there are these differences, this difference can be discovered on textual level, on lexical level, syntactic level, but the question is, why do they happen? So on the one hand, we have, of course, the impact of the source language, yeah, so of the source text. Also, we try to produce something in the target text, so maybe some kind of norms of the target text. But at the same time, we also have those processes of translation that translators, that text producers are exposed to. So these differences can be related to the process of translation from a source language expression to a target language expression. And also, if we say, okay, what we have in the source is different from what we have in the target. Yeah, think about explicitation, for instance. When we say, translated text is more explicit than the source. Yeah, how can we state this? We look into the original, say, yeah, this there was no connective and the translator added a connective, for instance. Yeah, so that's what I mean through the process of translation. So something is added in the translation on the one hand, and on the other hand, we say, okay, I have now here my corpus, my data of originally produced German, and I look into German translated from English, and this text differ from those which were originally produced in German. Yeah, so this is the difference of the translation product itself if compared to originals in the same language. And I was already mentioning explicitation. This is what I'm going to mainly speak about, explicitation and implicitation. There are many different definitions of what is more explicit, less explicit, more specified, less specified. That's why I added simplification, because if you say, okay, I have a less specific construction, which can be also regarded simpler from the point of view of semantic, yeah, carrying less information and so on. So explicitation and implicitation is defined in this case according to Claudi and Caroli. It is observed when a source language unit with a more general meaning is replaced by a translation unit with a more specific meaning. So in this case, we don't have a zero in the source and add something, but we have a general word, maybe a more general connective, and in the translation, translator decides to take a more specific, to use a more specific word. For instance, more specific connective. Another case is if a source text unit is unpacked and rendered as several units. Again, we have a more complex, more specific structure. And a translator adds new meaningful element into the text. Yeah, this is what was in the original example. As I said, there was no connective in the source, but the translator added something. And again, I put simplification here too, because sometimes we're not sure if we speak about implicitation or simplification. Yeah, so some cases of implicitation can be also related to simplification, depending on what kind of description level we use from the linguistic point of view. We speak about semantic, and we can say semantically simpler, yeah, more general. But simplification is traditionally defined in translation studies as like translations being linguistically simpler compared to the original target language production. For instance, lower type token ratio, yeah, lower language diversity, or having simpler syntactic constructions. But again, it depends on the, of course, on the language pair. Okay, what we know also from translation studies is that translationese may vary, yeah, depending on what kind of text we have, what we deal with. So we have register, mode, spoken, written, also producer dependent if we deal with texts translated by students or by professional translators, crowdsourced translators. And we also know a lot about the differences between translation and interpreting, because this is something that we are interested in our project. So interpreting reinforces features of oral production. Yeah, that's what we learned from corpus-based studies. And translation reinforces features of the written production. Now we say interpreting is an extreme case of spoken language production, and translation is an extreme case of written production. And there is less variation in terms, I was talking about type token ratio generally of lexical items, but also in terms of such linguistic constructions as connectives, yeah, which may, for instance, signal if something is more explicit or less explicit. And why does it happen? Well, we know that interpreting is a different process. Yeah, translators normally have a lot of time to produce their translations. Well, depending on their order, of course, if the customer needs it very urgently, then of course not so, but still they have many resources at their disposal. Interpreters do not have that many resources at their disposal. Yeah, they prepare. Of course, they have their notes and various also tools, yeah, nowadays even automatic translation, but still the process of interpreting is cognitively very demanding, yeah, because the delay between input and output is really small, yeah. That's why interpreters interpret normally in pairs, and they interpret a maximum of 5 or 10 minutes, and then they change, yeah, because it's really extremely demanding. And I mean simultaneous interpreting, yeah, not consecutive interpreting. And from what we know from the existing study, that interpreting tends to exhibit less explicitation. Yeah, we say like translated language should be, because we interpret, we explain something, but interpreting does not show that much explicitation, but shows implicitation and simplification instead. And now let's have a look at some examples, maybe to have a more clear picture what I mean with less explicit, more explicit. If we take German and English, I don't know how many of you speak German, but the German connective aber is something like but. And if we translate aber into however instead of but, yeah, we say that this is explicitation, because however is more specific than but. Yeah, it's a stronger signal of contrast relation than in case of however. So we interpret this case as explicitation, and this case as equivalence, yeah, because aber is equivalent to but in terms of the signal. So it's not so specific. Remember the definition of explicitation by Claudia and Caroli, where we said that the more general word is replaced by a more specific word, and this is this case. This is an example from the corpus where we have the same original, but a translator decided to translate aber with however, and interpreter used but instead. Yeah, so the less explicit item. Some other examples of explicitation can be seen here, again, into the other direction where we start from English. We have the English but, and in German translation, we have jedoch, which is again more explicit than aber. Yeah, and so it's like however. So in this case, we deal with explicitation. In the next one, we speak about equivalence. And here, the translator or interpreter left the connective out. So this is the case of implicitation. Yeah, just to briefly illustrate what we mean with these processes. And this can be considered as translation strategies. Yeah, so what kind of strategies do I apply? Do I use a more explicit item, the same kind of item, equivalent item, or I just leave it out? I was talking about using more general and more specific words in translation and interpreting. And in fact, if you compare texts in translation and interpreting, like we have in the European Parliament, we have the data. Well, everyone knows Europal corpus, but in fact, there is also spoken data in form of videos and audios, which can be transcribed. And if we compare the same speeches, which were spoken and then transcribed with the published speeches, then we would see the difference. Because here in interpreting, we see that interpreters use entities, for instance, instead of companies, a very small, particularly small people working for them instead of employees, amount, figures, and are active, operate. So on all levels, yeah, like verbs, nouns, adjectives are more general in interpreting and more specific in translation. From the point of view of semantics, as I said, we can also consider it as simplification if we think about the embedding into the deeper semantic analysis. We say that it's on the top. Think about WordNet, it would be somewhere on the top, and then company would be somewhere below. If we think about nouns and more not more general, sorry, more specialized discourse, for instance, specialized translation, terminology, when we deal with terminology in the text, we quite frequently deal not with just nouns, as we had here, company, but with compound words. Yeah, so multi-word expressions in English. In German, they are frequently written as one word. And if you look at this example of compound translation, where we have epilepsy syndrome in English, which is a term, yeah, medical term. It has two words, and it can be transferred into German with several equivalents. There were several. Now I'm speaking about equivalent, but meaning two different things, as in the previous slide. Several correspondences in German. Yeah, so we can translate it as Syndrom, we can translate it as Epilepsie-Syndrom or Syndrom mit epileptischen Anfällen. So here we have three different variants of translation, and translators may use one of them depending on the context, depending on for whom they are translating. And the case of implicitation will be this one, translating with a more general word, because syndrome is just like all kind of syndromes. This is the equivalence because this is a similar construction with the compound German epilepsy syndrome, and then explicitation where we have a prepositional phrase used to transfer this meaning. So this is how we would operationalize explicitation, implicitation, and equivalence strategies on the lexical level, yeah, on the level of nominal compounds. Okay, I was talking about the relation of translationese, for instance, explicitation to the process of translation, to the product of translation. And the question is, how can we analyze product and process? We are interested in these effects in various translation products, like in interpreting and in translation, but not only, as I said at the very beginning, not only just to say, okay, there are these differences, they exist, but also what are the driving forces behind them? Why do translators use more explicit words in this case, but not in the other case. Yeah. So the assumptions in the research agenda are the following: that explicitation is a strategy of audience design. Yeah. So that text producers or translators know that they have to make a certain item or certain information more explicit, more specific because of the audience, because of the target audience. So it helps to shape the content and to for the recipient and facilitate rational communication. Yeah, rational communication happens when both the producers and the receiver are happy and understand each other. In simpler words. And implicitation and equivalence also facilitate rational communication, but for the sake of the producer. Yeah, because why should I produce a more specific word if it costs me a lot of efforts to extract it from, say, company instead of entity, when I can use an equivalent construction, or I can leave it out. Yeah, so for the sake of the producer, my target audience will understand it anyway, so I don't have to, to produce these words. So I don't need to make this extra effort to produce a more explicit construction. So it also facilitates rational communication, but because of the other reason, because of the reason of the producer. And we expect differences in translationese effects across translation products. In our case, in our project, we looked into translation and interpreting. In one project, in the other project, we looked into translation in case of expert-to-expert communication, expert-to-layperson communication. So where you have very specialized text and less specialized text because the audience is not so the knowledge in the field is not so deep. And so the differences, we should probably expect also differences in the strategies of explicitation and implicitation, which are applied depending on the not only producer conditions, but also target audience. Okay, how can we analyze the differences? We know from the corpus-based studies that we can look into distributions of certain constructions, which are considered to be more explicit and less explicit. But we can also look into the process data like eye tracking. So eye tracking is the recording of eye movement, which eye fixation duration, which indicates how much of cognitive processing is located at a certain linguistic unit. Let's have a look first at the corpus-based analysis. So on the one hand, we can have comparable corpora where we say, okay, we have translated language and we have originally produced language. Yeah, this is the comparable, where the comparable corpora come into play, where we can observe general translationese effects. And when we have parallel corpora, we can really trace the differences that happened in translation, that we had the source language item that was transferred into the target with a different construction or was left out. So we can observe source language dependent or independent translationese. So we actually need both, yeah, to be able to describe all kind of translationese effects. So in our collaborative research center project in translation is rational communication, we are using both comparable and parallel corpora. And I mentioned Europal. So this is the corpus of written translation, the political speeches, which are published and can be downloaded and used. And we also have a corpus of interpreting. Yeah, these are recordings, the transcriptions of the recordings of the speeches, and they are interpreting. So interpreted corpus is much smaller because there is a lot of manual work involved into transcription of them. And to be able to not only descriptively analyze translationese, but also to link what we observe from the corpora to cognition, we use information theory. information theory and notions as surprisal, predictability, unpredictability, entropy. So there are different measures that you can use to approximate cognitive effort from the corpus data. Yeah, surprisal or unpredictability in context is a measure of information content on the one hand. That's what we know from information theory. But on the other hand, it correlates with cognitive effort. Yeah, so there were studies showing that there is a correlation. And apart from surprisal, which is normally calculated on monolingual data, we can also have such measures as translation entropy, yeah, where parallel data is used. So where do the measures come from? They come from language models, because imagine if we have a language model of English language and show this model the sentences, they are not surprising, so surprisal of the sentences would be low. But if we show these sentences instead, the language model, the English language model would be much more surprised to see those sentences. Yeah, so for every word in our corpus, we calculate surprisal. Yeah, so we annotate words in the corpora under analysis with surprisal, which come from language models. If you ask me technical questions of what kind of models we use, we try different models. So we use Ngram models, but we also use LLMs like GPT-2, and there are advantages and disadvantages of both that we can maybe discuss in the end of my talk. So the idea is to say, okay, if I have a connective however and connective but, and if I compare their surprisal in some contexts, they would have a similar surprisal, like however and but is less specific and however is more specific. But in some contexts, even but or even however would have a lower surprisal than but. Yeah, so everything depends on the context. Yeah, surprisal depends on the context. And which means that in some contexts, in some sentences, a more explicit construction would be more expected, yeah, if it has a lower surprisal than in the other. And this is how we try to explain why a translator decides to take, for instance, a more explicit construction, although it costs him or her more additional effort to produce it, but maybe it's more expected for the target audience. So surprisal may help to explain simplification effects. That's what we have shown in some studies, like interpreters tend to produce more expected, low surprisal lexical verbs and nouns. Remember my example with very active and operates, entities and companies, compared to original speeches, yeah, speeches produced by the delegates in the parliament. And we could also see that for the same information content, if we measure it in surprisal, in the source interpreters produce lower surprisal, yeah, if you compare them to translators, for instance. And we use surprisal to explain explicitation effects, and that's what I'm going to talk in more detail now. Not now, but first I will come to translation process before I come to the analysis and to the results. So with the translation process data, now why do we need translation process data if we can have surprisal? Well, with the translation process data, we can really see where when we read and when we produce a text, where we stay longer with our eyes, yeah, on which words, on which constructions. So we can analyze, for instance, typing pauses which precede the production. We can analyze total reading time of the translation unit on the source and on the target. Yeah, so how long did a translator fixate the connective before transferring it into a more explicit construction or less explicit construction, and also time to type the translation. Yeah, that's what we have from eye tracking, but also from keystroke logging. Yeah, so typing comes from keystroke logging. And this is something that is normally collected in experiments, which costs a lot of time and money and sometimes effort to collect participants. Instead, there is a possibility to use the data which was already produced in experiments. That's what we did in one of our studies. So we used a multilingual database called CRIT, Translation Process Database. It was recorded with translog, where you had eye tracking and keystroke logging data. And there were 6 English texts that were translated into German by 24 translators. And so the whole thing looks like a kind of a corpus where you query, for instance, you can search for the, in this example, I have because, but you could also search for but and observe its translation. Unfortunately, you can't see because of the resolution, but so we have, as I mentioned, 24 translators. 24 translators sometimes produce the same kind of translation, like they translated because as weil, but some of them selected aufgrund, wegen. Yeah, so for one word, you have several translations. And for every word, you have also a recording of how much time they spent on reading this because before they produce weil, and how much time they spent on producing weil, how much time they spent on the whole producing the construction. Yeah, so it's a kind of a corpus which is enriched with process data, which is very useful and nice to have. And we decided, as I say, not to, well, we didn't have any possibility to collect our own data at that time point. That's why we decided to take the data with that we have. Okay, now I come to the analysis, and I will first start with the discourse connectives. Remember the operationalization that but is translation with but is an equivalent translation, and translation with however is an explicit one. And so first, what we can get from the compral corpora, it's of course descriptive and descriptive results saying, okay, what kind of language product contains more explicit and more implicit items? Yeah, and we could see that translation preferred, or in translation we found most explicitation if compared to other language products. And looking into the parallel data from a descriptive point of view, we could observe the preferences for the strategies applied. So for instance, we could see that there was a difference in translation of different connectives. So but, which expresses the relation of contrast, and because, which expresses the relation of cause, contingency, had the different preferences for how they were transferred. Either they were more explicitly transferred or less explicitly, or is equivalent. However, this does not give us any explanation of why. Yeah, that's what we were searching for. That's why we collected information on surprisal. Yeah, so how surprising was explicit translation of but? How surprising was implicit translation of but? And what we could see, and also because we could see that for because, apparently, remember, as we said, that it looked different also in interpreting. So in interpreting than here for the translation of but. So what we could see is that apparently explicitation of because had lower surprisal than equivalent translation, which means that explicitation in this case facilitates the processing of the end product of translation on the side of the target audience. Then we, in another study, here we used comparable corpora, which means that we compared actually, so surprisal was calculated on the basis of monolingual corpora, for instance, taking interpreted output and original output, not taking into consideration what was actually in the original. Yeah. For this, you need parallel corpora. And we use parallel corpora, so on the one hand, to operationalize explicitation as it is, like specificity of each connective was defined as entropy of its sense distribution in relation to the entropy of all explicit relations in the corpus. And what we could see comparing translation across languages, so translation from English into German and from German into English, is that English connectives correspond to a wider range of German connectives than the other way around, which means that when translating into German, more explicitation is happening than if we translate from German into English. Yeah, that could be seen with the translation entropy, which is displayed here. So translation entropy also varies across translation products. Yeah, I was speaking about translation into English and into German, but not about interpreting. So if you compare translation entropy of the same connective, let's take here however and but, across interpreting and translation, you can see that the entropy of the same connective is lower in interpreting than in translation. Why does it happen? So how is it calculated? We have, for instance, connective however, which has, let's say, 10 correspondences in the translation. The same connective, however, would have less correspondences in interpreting, in the interpreted corpus, because interpreters do not use this wide range of correspondences to transfer. They restrict their repository to a smaller range of connectives. So they reduce entropy to reduce their cognitive effort. Yeah. Because if they have to decide between a wider range, they would need much more time to spend for the transfer. And what we could also observe in this case is that in case of cognitively harder relations, yeah, because those of you who deal with discourse connectives know that some discourse relations are harder to process than the others. So especially in case of harder relations, the entropy is reduced stronger in interpreting than in translation. And so interpreters use a limited range of connectives to translate a wide range of source connectives as well. This is also what can be seen here on this entropy distribution. Again, reducing the entropy. This is something that was also shown in process studies. Yes, that translation probability is reverse proportional of cognitive effort. And in our analysis using this translation process database, we could see that the translation probability of connective but, which can be transferred as aber, jedoch, doch, and obwohl, is the preferred strategy is equivalence. Yeah, so the translation probability of equivalence is much higher. And translation probability also correlates with other measures like reading time. And if we look into the total reading time of translation unit, we see that the sum of fixation duration of a particular connective, in this case, but, is that for aber, the translators spend less time on reading both on the source and on the target when they produce an equivalent translation instead of explicit translation. Yes, which means that deciding for a less explicit, mostly equivalent translation reduces the processing effort. So coming back to the hypothesis that I put at the beginning of the presentation. Explicitation is a strategy of audience design as it helps to shape the content for the recipient and thus facilitates rational communication. Yes, but for certain connectives only, maybe for certain relations only. So it's really used for audience design, but we could see this for certain connectives only. Because it still requires the highest cognitive effort on translator side. This is what we could see from translation process data. Implicitation and equivalence also facilitate rational communication, but for the sake of the producer, yeah, as they may reduce the effort of translator side. And we could actually see that a special equivalence reduces the effort, not necessarily implicitation. Yeah, sometimes translators spend more time on, deciding to leave this connective out or not. And we expected differences in translationese effects across translation products, where we dealt with interpreting and translation. And we could see that interpreters reduce translation entropy by using a limited range of connectives. Yeah, so to say, making their job then easier because of the restricted cognitive resources and also of the restriction of time. That's what we could see on the basis of discourse connectives. And do I have time to talk about about compound nouns? I'm coming back to this slide where I said that you have to extract, from the semantic point of view, you have to extract, entities are embedded on the top and companies are deeply embedded in the semantic network, of the meaning. And that's why it would be harder to extract more specific words. So smaller and more general transfer lexicon eases the retrieval. Yeah, this is the assumption. If we use words that are very general, then it's easier for us to produce the output. So it's easier for interpreters to produce this output. We could see it in a study where we calculated the word net depth. Yeah, you can calculate it on the basis of those semantic embedding for the top most frequent words used in our corpora in interpreted and translated language. And what we could see is that for interpreting, from the term of, in terms of frequencies, the words that are embedded on the top, they were most frequent ones. So deeper depth was observed in written production, and written originals and translation employ more specific nouns, which means that they are more explicit if you look into nouns. And surprisal, in terms of surprisal, which indicates cognitive effort, we could also see that it correlates with word net depth. So that in all translation products, we could observe a positive correlation between surprisal and word net depth. Then we decided to combine surprisal with word net depth to calculate another score. Yeah, so it combines word net depth with surprisal by multiplying word net average depth of a word and its surprisal value in context. And we could see that for interpreting, we observe the lowest level of specificity of words. Yeah, so in this way, we try to operationalize specificity and genericity of words. And the highest level was observed for written, especially in written translation, and the lowest one was observed in interpreting, which we interpreted as explicitation in translation and implicitation in interpreting. If we go further and look into translation process data with compounds, remember my example with epilepsy syndrome, which can be translated as syndrome, which is a more general word, and with an equivalent and with explicitation, we see that translators spend less time on reading the source and the tagging when they decide for an implicit variant. Yeah, in this case, implicit variant, just using syndrome instead of using a specialized word. We could also see that translation in this case, we have three correspondences. Yeah, we have three variants, but it may happen that you have an item which may have various translation variants. Yeah, so not three as in this case, but 5 or 10. And the more translation variants you have, the harder it is to take a decision, because the probability of translation of every variant then decreases, and translation entropy increases. So translation entropy correlates with cognitive efforts, which could also be shown on the basis of translation process data. Yeah, so here we have reading times from the source on the target, pauses and duration of production. And below you see the translation entropy. And in every case, we had again a positive correlation with cognitive effort. Translation entropy also impacts the strategy that a translator decides to take. That's what we could also see in our data. Equivalence facilitates the process of translation, facilitates rational communication for the sake of the producer, in this case, translator, because for the equivalence, we observe the lowest translation entropy if compared to explicitation and implicitation. Besides that, the target audience may also impact the translation strategies. Yeah, remember I was talking about expert-to-expert communication and expert-to-lay person communication. And we could observe in our data that the decision to translate with an equivalent was more frequently used in expert-to-lay person communication than in expert-to-expert communication, and explicitation was used in in case of texts where we had expert-to-expert communication, so an expert audience as a target audience. So explicitation does depend on target audience, and which means that translators decide to translate something with a more explicit item, although in fact it costs them more effort, which you can see on this slide, where we have number of fixation on source text and on target text, so the reading time. And for the explicit variants, translators always need more time, so which we interpret as more cognitive effort, more processing effort. But at the same time, there is a variation depending on, again, on the audience. If a translator translates for a text which has as a target audience lay person or as an expert. So the level of specialization of the text also impacts the strategy. Okay, coming back again to the same hypothesis where we said that explicitation is a strategy of audience design and helps to shape the content for the recipient and also facilitates rational communication. We can say yes, but it depends on the type of the text we deal with. Yeah, on the type of the text, I mean here, if the text is in the area of expert-to-expert communication, expert-to-lay person, and still requires high cognitive effort on the translator side, which means that for the producer, explicitation is always demanding. And which means, again, that if it's used, then for specific purpose, because it is required on the target side. Implicitation and equivalence also facilitate rational communication, but for the sake of the producer. And here again, as in case of discourse connectives, we could see that, especially in terms of equivalence, especially in the case of equivalence, it facilitated the production. There were differences in terms of translationese effects. So in case of translation and interpreting, implicitation was more evident in interpreting, even more than equivalence, and explicitation depends on the target audience, if we deal with layperson or with expert translators. Okay, coming back to the idea of combining corpus-based studies, corpus-based methodology and translation process research. We have in both cases advantages and disadvantages. In terms of translation process, or let's say experimental research, you have very restricted number of data, very small data, mostly very controlled in terms of selected sentences. If you remember my slide presenting this database, 6 texts translated by 24 translators, but not hundreds of texts that we have in corpora. However, I think that a combination of both is a good idea to get more insights into why the phenomena that we observe, and we state, okay, the languages are different, or the translations are different from the original production in terms of the use of connectives, in terms of lexical items. But we can try to explain why it's happening only using both approaches, both experimental and product research. If we speak about corpora and say, okay, but I can calculate surprisal, and surprisal, there are studies showing that surprisal correlates with effort, with cognitive effort. Why should I care and perform experiments to have the eye tracking data? Well, here everything depends on what kind of models you use. So in fact, with the language model, you hope to model the language use of a person. But if we use, for instance, pre-trained large models like GPT and try to explain my language use, for sure, I don't have that much knowledge that GPT has because I haven't read the whole internet. And that's why it's always the question of what kind of model shall I use. So in our project, we tried various models, and we came to the conclusion that the best option for us to explain, for instance, difference between spoken and written language, to stick to the Ngram models, which are trained on our corpus. Just because if we try it with GPT does not give us any difference with the surprisal scores, no difference between interpreted and translated speech, because for this model, it's like all the, political discourse, and that's why it looks different from the general language use. So this is always the question of the choice of the models and of the data. And this is what I see as a problem or as an issue to deal with. And in terms of experimental research, again, the access to the data. We did perform some experiments, but it really costs a lot of time to find participants, to find money for every kind of research, but to find participants, to control for participants. Again, what kind of participants you have? Do you have trained translators? Do they actually work in natural environment when they come and have to translate with this eye tracking equipment? So you put some restrictions on it. So it's not that natural as the corpus data. That's why a combination of both is a better solution from my point of view. And this is something that is open for discussion, and I will happy to hear your questions or comments. Thank you very much.
Well, sorry. Thank you very much for your presentation. I think at least what I take kind of at home message is the variety of factors which you talked about and which are involved in the translation process, of which we have not been, or at least I have not been aware. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. And now let me open discussion. Oh, yes.
Thanks. I've been following your talk actually remotely, so don't be surprised that I have questions.
I thought so, yeah.
I have two questions and one comment. So I'll maybe start with the comment. Last year, September 2023, we had a paper with a master student of mine, and it was an analysis of compounds for English to German translation. I'm mentioning the year because there were very few LLMs, or maybe no LLMs included in that analysis yet. But what we observed on the WMT test set was that even machine translation systems which perform on par with human translators or close to that produce about 1/3 fewer compounds than humans. So my question is whether you have any explanation for this, and it's all, I think it's also related to the cognitive effort. So what is more? What do you expect as be more demanding for the producer, to produce a compound or to produce it explicit coming from English?
So maybe I start with the last part. Is it will be probably, so there are even studies on compounds from experimental research showing that the easiest the easiest strategy is to use the equivalent construction. Yeah, for instance, sometimes, like especially between the closely related languages as English and German, sometimes you have very similarly looking like or sounding like constructions, and this will be the most common strategy, especially if you don't have restrictions. But then those restrictions, like the norms, yeah, the text type, the genre, come into play, and that in this case you need to decide if this is the right one or maybe not the right one. But if you have the possibilities to take, you know, the default one, like cognates, for instance, yeah, so this is the preferred strategy, then this is the least cognitively demanding one. As for the first part, there is an interesting thing, you know, human translators produce less compounds than original speakers. Yeah, we are speaking about translationese, and there was also a PhD thesis on German-Italian translation or Italian-German translation, and the author, the colleague Anna Weber, she showed that in fact, human translators, when they translate from a language which does not have those compounds as we have in German, like written in one word, they would just translate with a prepositional phrase or with a different phrase instead of taking a compound, because they have this shining through the impact of the source text, yeah, source language that comes into play. So maybe, since large language models are trained with human data, well, of course, if you have a multilingual not translation model, then you would also have a monolingual data with enough number of compounds. But I think this is maybe like an overgeneration effect that we see in the human translations that then come in the machine translation. You know, extreme case of translationese. So you have human translationese, but if we speak about machine translationese, they will be even more extreme in being different from original production. This would be my assumption.
So here the situation was that it was standard neural MT systems, more of them, so not LLMs, and they produce fewer compounds than the translator. And that goes against what you were saying, that human translators actually tend to mimic the source because this is like professional translators. So I think that they are like paid by so the faster they are, the better for them, right? So I think that they would put not enough effort and produce a structure which is similar to English and less.
Well, by professional translators, as I say, they know the norms of the language, they know the requirements. So probably not necessarily, they would not necessarily always decide for, you know, for this default and easiest way of translating. It's rather the case of, you know, extreme situations, like time pressure, for instance, and students during an exam. Yeah. But those who have time, even if they have to produce more translations to earn more money, they would, of course, care for the quality, yes. Okay. But as I say, my explanation would be, we observe this trend in human translation using less compounds, and then, yeah, machine translation.
I speak some German, so is it actually easier for the native German speaker to produce a compound or not? Because I think it's easier because in the compound you do not have to specify the relations between the elements. But I may be wrong with this intuition. So.
I can't answer this question. I think it depends again on the context. Like if in an everyday speech, probably no one would produce too many. And there are also differences in what kind of compounds. Yeah, you have those compounds which are lexicalized that cannot be splitted, and those compounds that are very like German is very productive in terms of morphology, and you can, you know, make compound almost of every word. But then I would say that in a highly, like in specific domain-specific situations, in specialized communication, it would be more common than in everyday speech, I would say.
Yeah. So maybe if there are other questions, come back to my. Okay, so I can keep asking. So no, that's I have one suggestion. So you had this example with but in English going to jedoch, and then the jedoch going to however. So the explicitation that happened from English to German was then kind of maintained in the back translation. So but you did that only for the purpose of glossing, so that non-German speaking audience would know. So the idea is, have you considered back translation as a means of discovering this? Because if you use a quite literal machine translation. You could scan and see whenever a but went back to however, and
yeah, it's a good idea. Yeah. So this is what we observed in the human translation is this asymmetry of explicitation effects, that more explicitation happening into German and less explicitation happening into English. And which means that if we back translate, we should actually observe the same trend, but maybe not.
Yeah, so maybe just like as a search tool, so that would allow you to quickly find expressions where this happened.
Yeah.
So, and my last question is very much related to this, non-equivalence of explicitation. So, when going into German, more explicitation happens than backwards. So than into English. So my question is, do you know the mother tongue of the translators? So I think that is it more Germans or more English speakers?
So in our corpus, we are sure. Well, we think we're 99% sure that these are the translators into German are native speakers of German, and translators into English are native speakers of English, because they are from the European Parliament. They are working for the European Commission.
Okay, yeah, because I was thinking that even if it's now I don't know is it L2 translation or something like that, so then it would be more natural that the German natives would be less explicitating into English, even though they have the abilities and skills to do that.
No, there are no L2.
It's native speakers.
Yeah, they're native speakers
on the target. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
But what I would expect in this L2 production is same kind of effects that you observe in translation, the shining through or interference of the source language. That is that we observe in translation, even if they're produced by native speakers, but you have this constraint from the source language, and L2 speakers have the constraint of the mother tongue, which has also an impact.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inspiring talk.
Thank you.
So I have just some very small comments or observations. One point, well, thank you enough for the back translation. That would have been one of my comments. Then, if I understood well, you said that the original text has more specification, and the intertranslations simplification, or was it the other way around?
If we compare spoken language production, in interpreted language, we have more simplification and implicitation than in the original speeches, produced by, in our case, politicians, the delegates in the European Parliament. Maybe also because sometimes they are prepared, so sometimes they read out what or someone wrote for them, sometimes they are spontaneous. We have also this differentiation between read out, prepared speeches, mixed speeches, and spontaneous speeches, and which we also considered in one of our studies to see if there are any differences. And there were language specific differences. So in one way it worked, there were differences, but in the other there were no differences. But yeah.
And another small comment, it seemed to me that you did not take into consideration the synonyms. I mean, what I could say that, I don't know, however and but, for instance, at least in some contexts, I would say that are replaceable, which means that I would take them as synonyms. And you somehow did not consider this possibility in the research, or did you?
So in one of the studies, like with Francis Jung and Vera Demberg, so here we looked into the relation. So for every connective, we define if it is more specific or more general depending on how many relations it expressed. And for instance, however has less options than but, because but is more ambiguous. But what we didn't do is like say, okay, I have but for the expression of contrast, I have however, but I can also have something else. Yeah, and but well, of course, we would consider this if we take the translation, a certain connective which aligns to however, but what else could we have? In contrast, yes. So in this case, we would do it. We would do so. So I do think that in this study where we use actually discourse parser. So it will the English and the German parts of the text were annotated with discourse parsers, and when we aligned on the word level, we aligned connectives, and all the correspondences should be there. I think so, but I cannot show 100% sure if it is the case. Yeah, if the synonyms are also considered there, but I would assume so. Yeah, we say okay, in contrast, but and however, all aligned to aber.
Yeah, I mean, you made a remark at the end, so I only made a note that you said that it's important to take into account who is the translator. And my remark was to say that not only the translator, but also the audience. But that's what you added at one of your final slides.
Mm. But so the audience, I mean, translators, when they are trained, yeah, like our students, when they are trained, they learn to analyze the target audience, yeah, the requirements that a customer has, yeah, so this is formulated in translation brief and translation order for whom the text is going to be, yeah, because sometimes you have a different target audience than the source text, yeah, so sometimes you have this kind of adaptation of the text. And it's not necessarily taken into account in the studies, yeah, or in the selection of the data which we deal with. We work a lot with data translated by students, which of course differs in quality and in its features from professional translators. And in machine translation, I mean, there is much data which produced by crowd, so like crowdsourced translations, which again have a different, I would say they are different to what you have from professional translators, which cost a lot of money mostly. Anya?
Just a small question about compounding. How do you consider, what do you consider a compound when you go from English to German? So epilepsy syndrome, is it really compound, or how can you define it?
I mean, in German, it's easy to define compounds. It's just one word, one complex word. But in English, it's a very good question. Yeah, so we call it multi-word expression, and there is also an active research area to say when a multi-word expression is actually a compound. I don't know, like a native speaker of English, if you can, you have a kind of a rule. So it's really hard to define. And in this case, we actually looked into words that you said, like, this is a set expression. This is I don't know. In the kind of a vocabulary in a dictionary, it's inserted as a compound. Mm-hmm. Especially in specialized texts, yeah, you have a lot of them. But this is, as I say, it's a good question to say what is actually what shall we consider a compound in English and what not.
So you're not biased by German in this case?
No, probably yes, because we have translations. Always, if you have parallel data, you are somehow biased and look into translations. But in this research, we started from English, so we looked into the English text and said, okay, what is a compound and what is translated? But sometimes it's hard to decide and to say, okay, is this adjective part of this compound, or is it just, you know, a more defined expression of noun? compound.
Thank you. May I have just one? Actually, you have already asked and discussed it, but this is my prominent question I also have when you speak about translations. I'm really wondering about the person of translator in this. So definitely, so you take this into account, but still I'm very much interested in the kind of insight. Can you really rely on the data and kind of forget the fact that some translators really have strong tendency to generalize and some other people have strong tendency to specify. So this is what we meet in our texts now. And how far is that a topic?
So what you're talking about
discussion
is translator style, and it's mostly research in the area of literature translation, yeah, because you have a book by some famous author which was translated into several variants, and then you have translator style, or you have a literary translator who translated many authors and has his or her own style. In this case, of course, if we have the data and if we select the text translated by the same author, and then by the second author, we could probably also analyze this variation and see if some translators tend to specify and the others tend to underspecify. But for this, we need the metadata, which we sometimes do not have. If we take just the corpora which exists, if we perform experiments, we control for those, for the selection of participants. Yeah.
Oh, so Alexander Rosen is raising hand. Can you please speak up if you have any questions.
Okay. Hi, Katja. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm not Alexander Rosen.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Hello, Katja. Thank you very much for a great talk, and really, I'm happy to see you again. I was just wondering about one detail in your data. Did you observe more explicitation in expert-to-expert communication? Am I right? I was a little bit surprised about this.
Yeah.
Have you got an explanation? Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is so. On the one hand, it may be surprising. We say like, yeah, expert to expert, they don't need explanation. Why should we explain? But I think this is also a matter of how you define explicitation. So explicitation in terms of compounds, like using more specific words, because those specific words would be not understandable for people who are not familiar with this terminology. Yeah. So if I not familiar, well, maybe this example that I have with the epilepsy syndrome is not so illustrative, but it's like maybe more people know what a syndrome is than and less people know what epilepsy syndrome is. Yeah, and that's why it's more specific, because it's also dependent on the not world knowledge, but in this case medicine knowledge. Yeah.
Mhm.
And that's why in expert-to-expert communication, the experts, they communicate with their own specialized language from their domain. But in the expert-to-lay communication, the specific terms, they are used, but they need to be explained. Yeah, so we need to introduce a definition of it. That's why they are not so frequently used in translation.
Okay, thank you.
Avoid ambiguity, because in the expert-to-expert, there possibly. So I'm just speculating about why expert-to-expert translation would possibly use more explicitation. My suggestion or idea is that it's to avoid ambiguity, where many terms, of course, are used across the field. And since you, as the translator, are able to diagnose this ambiguity, the source, and you know which one to put there, and so you do it so that this effort is then safe to your fellows in the expert domain. Would that sound plausible?
Yes, probably. Yeah, because as I said, and it's also depending on the level of the knowledge. Like for the experts who say, yeah, it's maybe too boring just to read about some kind of syndromes. They need some specific knowledge. They want to get some information, some specific, not linguistic, but I mean the field information, yeah, the area information and the medicine from this field. And for the layperson, there's like a general, maybe interested in the topic, but they don't need, and they don't have this knowledge to understand all those specific terms. And that's why they are not transferred and not translated.
So we see one more raised hand. So just speak up. I don't know who is asking that question because I can. David.
Yes, David Maracek, Translation in Studies Institute, Charles University. Thank you, Katja, for your interesting talk. I come from the realm of translation studies, so I have my own comments and examples of explicitation, implicitation, and it's fascinating to see some real data, empirical ones. Just 2 comments, if I may. Can you hear me? I mean, just
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Because when I teach translation theory and translation procedures to translator trainers, I discuss explicitation, implicitation a lot, and I tell them this is one of the most fascinating, procedures, and one of the reasons why translators tend to use explicitation was discussed as far back as the 1950s by Jiří Levý, the famous Czech scholar, who said, yes, translators tend to be explicit because their nature, simply, it's their DNA, says that they approach text and they approach translation as interpreters, interpret in sensu stricto. So they like to, because they process the text, they process the content, and the things they know about the text, what's behind the lines, behind the text, they tend to make it explicit. They know it, so they tell their readers, and they forget that sometimes this is not desirable, especially in literary translators, in literary texts, where you have to leave some space for interpretation for the reader. You don't serve them everything explicitly. So that's perhaps one insight into the process why translators do this. And one more point, when Ondřej, I think, discussed the question of direction, whether there is more explicitation by L2 translators or L1 translators. There is an interesting piece of research, again from the 1990s. My colleague Miroslav Pošta, who's a household name in audiovisual translation, but he wrote a diploma thesis on explicitation, and he found that when Czech people translate into English, or when they when they produce a piece of writing in English, they tend to transfer these explicit noun phrases from Czech into English. I'll give you a simple example. Služby v oblasti marketingu. Yeah? Services in dem Bereich von Marketing. Now, that's something no native speaker of German or English would say. Marketing service and marketing services, it's not a compound in English, but it's very close to German compounds, okay? These noun phrases with pre-modification. And Czech speakers tend to ignore this systemic difference, and they simply copy the same structure. So they Chenglish will, the Czech version of English will say services in the area, in the field of marketing. And that's not just their preference. That's not just about saying the translation is explicit. It's a bad translation because in terms of pragmatics and communication, and that's what real translation is about, you send a different signal. Služby v oblasti marketingu in Czech is nepříznakové, unmarked, okay? And when you keep the same amount of explicitness into English, you produce something which is marked, příznakový. So that's a bad translation. You overload the communication channel, and you, by saying in the field of marketing, you place too much emphasis on something that is not necessary. So that's just what I know about this, and wanted to give you some food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much. But your example is really the example of L2. This is what you ask, I think. So L2 production, where we have the shining through or interference from the source language. I think this is one of good illustration of this.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
So there are no questions from the online audience. Well, thank you again for giving us a larger and deeper picture into the process of translation. So I think that we really got more insight that we have ever had. I would like to invite all of you to the next Monday talk, which will be given by Tara Blevins from the University of Vienna. And we will again touch upon multilinguality, but with regard to language models. So you are most welcome next Monday. So thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Jenom obecně.